Okay, I think we got all that fixed now. The same thing, I don't know what's wrong fundamentally, but the same fix as last week worked. We shut it all down and turned it back on, and it's all working fine again. But, we had like 4 different programs that we got to get open nowadays to be able to do church. You got YouTube, and we've got our broadcasting suite, and we've got the PowerPoint, and had to make sure that was all up and running and that the sound was working and everything, but I think it's all going to be good to go now. So we've already lost a few minutes this morning, so we want to go ahead and get started pretty quickly. We're in Job chapter 40 today as we continue God speaking. And just to remind you, especially those who missed some of these, of the overall shape of the book. We all know about all the bad things that happened to Job and how Job then starts to question what's happened to him. He curses the day that he was born, and his friends then, his 3 friends, start to speak to him about that, and their worldview is rooted in this doctrine of retribution, that if you're suffering, it's because you're a sinner. The righteous are blessed without any exception, the wicked are punished. Because Job is suffering so much, he must be a great sinner. And so their speeches to him are focused on trying to get him to repent. But Job, as we all know from reading the beginning of the book, Job isn't a great sinner. He's a man who's blameless and upright, who feared God and turned away from evil. That's the whole reason that this contest between God and Satan exists. So the bulk of the beginning part of this dialogue, chapter 4 through chapter 27, is Job and his friends going back and forth. The friends dig in their heels further and further and start to finally accuse Job of some specific crimes. Meanwhile, Job realizes that his friends don't have any sort of wisdom or instruction to offer him, and so he increasingly turns his attention to God, hoping to find some answers there. Why is this all happening? And that all reaches its climax in this oath of innocence that he swears in chapters 29 through 31, where he starts to list off these specific sins. He swears with some curses, if he's lying, that he hasn't committed any of them, and the idea is to force God's hand, that God either has to curse him or he has to come down and speak to him, address him, because that's the way it would have worked in an ancient court of law. But God doesn't speak immediately, because of course you can't force God's hand that way. God isn't in any human being's debt. First of all, this young man Elihu speaks. He kind of prepares the way for God. We've spent a few weeks looking at his speeches. And then finally, we've begun to see these last couple of weeks that God at last speaks out of the storm. This is what this whole book has been building toward, because Job is longing for this word from God. He wants God to speak to him. He wants God to give him some answers. The same questions that all of us sort of have when bad things happen to us. Why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this? So this has all been building toward God speaking, and yet his coming still seems to surprise everybody, and in particular, what he says is unexpected, because on the one hand, Job's been complaining. Job swears this oath of innocence. God just ignores everything that Job said, essentially. He doesn't respond specifically to anything that Job said. Meanwhile, Job's friends have said that he's a great sinner and he needs to repent, but God doesn't take up their cause either. He doesn't talk about any sins Job's committed or say that he needs to repent. Instead, what we've seen, we looked through that first speech the last couple of weeks, God addresses Job like a teacher. He's trying to instruct Job, trying to get him to get a little bit of insight into the way that he governs the world wisely and justly. And what we saw in that first speech is this series of rhetorical questions that God uses, in particular regarding the natural world. That last chapter is all about these animals that he's made. And do you understand them, Job? What do you know about the way that they were designed? Or can you explain them? And of course, Job can't. The questions aren't designed to be answered. They're designed to impress Job with just how little he knows in comparison to God, and remind him that God's the one who rules the world, controls the world justly and wisely. The whole point of that last section about the animals that we wrapped up with last week is that if he cares for those animals that he created, isn't he going to care for Job? Human beings are the pinnacle of God's creation. It's the same point Jesus makes in the Sermon on the Mount, right? That your heavenly Father cares for the birds of the air, the lilies of the field, and aren't you more valuable than they are? Same idea. Don't you know that God is going to care for Job? And not just any human being, his servant, Job, the way that he talks about him there. So the whole point of that is that Job's suffering hasn't taken place outside of God's control, outside of his knowledge, outside of his wisdom and his care for creation. So if Job's called into question God's lordship, which he has, at least implicitly, he's wrong, because the world hasn't stopped turning. The fabric of creation hasn't torn apart at the seams. It's still going on. And it doesn't demonstrate that God acts unjustly, because everything that happens under his wise counsel. So the question now is, how is Job going to respond to all that? And we have his brief response in verses 3 through 5 of chapter 40. You notice as they've been put up there, he has little to say. There's not much to this. Job chapter 40, verse 3. Job answered the Lord and said, "Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I've spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further." Now, this is pretty remarkable if we've read through this entire book. Job is not a man of few words. He's normally pretty talkative. I mean, if you study this whole book, of course, we had a long interlude with our disruption to class where we weren't studying it, but if you remember back to those early speeches, I mean, Job can go on and on for chapters at times. So here is this loquacious fellow. He's reduced to silence. He doesn't have anything to say here in response. He's just been overwhelmed by God's majesty. He's starting to realize his insignificance there in comparison. I am of small account. What shall I answer you? He admits it. He's not in any position to answer God. In some ways, this is exactly what he feared would happen. If you were to go back to when Job speaks in chapter 9, verse 14, he said that he was afraid that if God were to ever answer him, that he wouldn't be able to respond, that he wouldn't be able to find the words to say. But the difference is, if you read through that whole section there, and we won't read it for time's sake, but it's chapter 9, verses 13 through 24. He's afraid there that God's just going to beat him down, essentially, with his power, because God is so awesome, so powerful, that he's just not even going to give Job a chance. But that's not what happens here. God actually gives Job a chance. Come on, respond. What do you have to say to me? Answer me if you can. It's God's rhetoric that's left him dumbfounded. Job doesn't have anything to say because there's no answer that he could give. And so he lays his hand on his mouth. That's both astonishment and restraining himself from speaking. But we need to notice something important here and why God goes into a second speech, the progression. Job might not have anything to say in his defense at this point. He might not have anything to add. But he still doesn't withdraw his complaint yet. That's what he's ultimately going to do after this second speech. The fact that he doesn't speak up in his defense tells us that he's starting to feel the impact of what God says. He realizes that there's truth in it. He realizes that he's probably spoken out of turn. But he isn't quite ready to give up just yet. He doesn't withdraw that complaint that he's made. So God is going to speak again to try to persuade Job to submit. And that's why we have this second speech, chapter 40 and chapter 41. In this one, God continues to challenge Job. So in that sense, there's a lot of similarity to that first speech. Job has wanted to dispute with God. There's this legal metaphor that runs throughout the book. It's like a court case, and Job considers God, well, we've talked about this tension. It's interesting. He considers God both to be his adversary and to be the just judge, and he wants God to rule justly sort of against himself and for Job, rather. But the whole point of this speech is, if Job is right, if God has acted unjustly, well, then that means really that Job must be wiser than God. Job must be more powerful than God, and Job must be able to humble anyone who would come up against him. So God challenges him in this speech to prove it. Show that you can take on anything. You need to control the behemoth and Leviathan. That's what this speech is about. These are two great beasts that God has created, and the idea is if he can't master these, then he's going to have to give up his complaint, because if he can't master those, how can he ever hope to contend with God? And of course the implication is God can master those. He created them, in fact. So God controls everything in the world. So there are two parts to this speech, really. Fundamentally, there's questions to Job about his power, verses 6 through 14. And then these portraits of the two beasts, the behemoth, verses 15 through 24, and then Leviathan. And that's a long one. We won't even get into that today. We wouldn't have anyway, but especially with missing those first 10 minutes. That's chapter 41. But let's look at this first part here, sort of introduction, where God questions Job about his power. Chapter 40, verse 6. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Will you even put me in the world below? Then will I also acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you." So you notice, if you remember from that first speech, this one begins exactly the same way that one did. Dress for action like a man. Gird up your loins. Job hasn't withdrawn his case, so God's going to challenge him again. Okay, you still want more? Well, then get ready, buddy, because here it comes again. Job has made at least some veiled accusations, we can call it that, about the way that God governs the world. He's questioned his justice. And so rather than getting into these questions about nature again immediately, God actually confronts him directly here to begin. And he confronts him with the major flaw in his accusations. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be right? Now, Job hasn't actually said anything like that. And I think when it's put to him like this, when it's phrased this way, he would have realized, man, I really have spoken out of turn. I shouldn't have been questioning God, because he hasn't phrased his case quite that strongly. Job wouldn't have just come out and said God was unjust. But God's taking his arguments to their logical conclusion here in questioning God's justice and in acting as if God should hold himself accountable to Job, that he needs to answer Job for the way he's running the world. He's come pretty close to discrediting God. He wouldn't have thought of it that way, but that's the end result of it in questioning how God is going to govern everything. He's defended his innocence so strongly. He's just insisted he's not guilty, he's blameless, he hasn't done anything worthy of being punished the way that he has. He's actually ended up lashing out at God, talking about him as if he's the one oppressing him. So he's essentially, not in so many words, but essentially, he's charged God with acting unjustly towards him. So to presume that he is innocent and that God is treating him unfairly, that's walking pretty close to that line of presumptuous pride. Job is teetering on the edge here of committing a sin. But I do want us to observe, God doesn't accuse Job of committing a specific sin. And in the end, he's going to say that Job spoke rightly of him in comparison to his friends. So what we need to remember is that God agrees with Job insofar as Job has lived a righteous life. Job really is innocent. I mean, that's the whole reason he's been held up as an example, right? Have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him, God says to Satan. That's a compliment to him. God endorses that characterization of him. But if things are going to be set right, Job feels alienated from God. He feels that there's this obstacle in their relationship. If they're going to be back in this right relationship, then Job is the one who needs to alter his attitude, because he's come pretty dangerously close to trusting in his own righteousness, his own works. And that avowal of innocence that he made when he talks about all the great things that he's done and that he hasn't done those bad things, that comes pretty close to making it all about how wonderful he is, trusting in himself and his good works. And his complaint then makes it seem sometimes like he thinks he's more righteous than God. Again, I don't think he believes that. God doesn't accuse him of that specifically, but the idea is he's getting really close to that. It's a warning. You need to be careful. That's why pride is treacherous. It might even be most treacherous when we actually have some good root cause to be prideful the way Job does. If we're correct in our position, or if we actually have done good deeds, and if we really aren't engaging in sin like so many we see around us, that's when it's maybe the most treacherous of all. I remember reading C.S. Lewis, and this is just to paraphrase him here because this just came to me now, but Lewis talks about the fact that the devil is more than happy to see you become virtuous and to see you do good deeds and to do God's will in that sense, if at the same time you can become eaten up with pride in it, because that in the end is going to destroy you. And that's what Job is teetering close to here, this pride that's distorting his perspective and causing him to put himself up on a pedestal. So Job has the right to complain about his misfortune. I think that's one of the things that's so important that this book teaches us. It's okay to not understand what God's doing. It's okay to get upset. It's okay to cry out to him, to lament. We see that in the Psalms too. That's something that God's people do. And in the book of Job, when God says that Job's spoken rightly of him, we get this sense that God can take that. He understands that, the fact that we might lash out at him a little bit. But now Job's in danger because in the end, you have to assent to God's purpose, to God's plan, even when you don't understand. And the problem is he's in danger of crossing that line and putting himself in that position of being the judge. As it goes on here, the problem is, and God gets at this, his vow, his complaint, again, he wouldn't say this, but he's implied that he knows more than God, that God should answer to him. And so God questions him here, and the sense is, if you know so much, then you ought to be able to rule according to your ideal. You think you know the way the world should be run? Well, then you should be able to do it yourself. What do you need me for? If you can prove your superiority, then I'll acknowledge your complaint. That's what God effectively says here. But if not, then Job has to acknowledge that God's actually the one in control. So that's why he specifically challenges him to exercise his authority over those who are mighty, those who are proud, in verses 10 through 13. There are 4 verses here with 10 imperatives. And the point is that these are things that a person might try to do, but ultimately only God can do them. People aren't capable of doing things. Job must, verse 10, adorn himself with majesty, with glory, with splendor, etc. Heaping up these words captures this overwhelming sense of God's awesomeness, God's majesty. Job obviously can't clothe himself in those things the way that God can, and he urges him to, you think you're in control? Well, then show it. Wipe out all of the proud. You think that I need to execute justice immediately? Well, then why don't you do it? That's verses 11 through 13. Job's complained that, hey, the wicked go out here unpunished. The friends have argued, and Job used to believe if you're wicked, you're going to be punished. But Job looks around and he says, no, man, I see bad people who continue to prosper. It's like that song we sing, Farther Along. Then do we wonder why others prosper, living so wicked year after year? That's come out in Job's speeches. So God says, all right, you think that the wicked need to be punished immediately? You think I'm not doing it? Well, then you do it. Show me how powerful you are. Go ahead and punish them. Inaugurate your world order. Do it the way you think it should be done. And God says, if you can do that, then I'll acknowledge you've won. You're stronger than I am. You're the victor. You would have proved your complaint here that God rules without any sort of justice. There's a really ironic tone here in God's argument, obviously, because if Job could do all that, he wouldn't need God in the first place. He wouldn't have to be crying out to God to give him justice, to come down and explain himself. Job wouldn't have any need of pleading helplessly for a vindicator if his own right hand could deliver him. And of course it can't. God knows that. Job knows that. We know that. To persuade him then to abandon his complaint, we go back into these questions about creation and about nature and about the animal world in particular. God is going to quiz him about these two ominous beasts that we've probably heard of because they're proverbial, the behemoth and the Leviathan. In talking about these, God's purpose is again to remind Job of his lordship, to try to get him to submit to that. He uses irony, he uses absurd arguments to try to get Job to wake up to just how absurd his position is. He's laying bare that pride that we've said underlies his whole avowal of innocence that he's made. Job has to realize his position, that he's a creature, not the Creator. And so he has to humble himself in complete dependence on the Creator. The identification of the behemoth and the Leviathan is disputed. As I said, we're not going to talk about the Leviathan today, just the behemoth. These have been identified, though, both of them, with anything, well, from all sorts of different earthly beasts to mythical monsters. That is, that these aren't real, these are mythological. God's using these sort of hypothetically. From real animals that are familiar to us to those that are now extinct. Some have even argued that these are referring to dinosaurs. And those guys at Apologetics Press, for instance, they've written a lot about that sort of thing, that these are references to dinosaurs. Without getting too lost in the weeds on that sort of thing, especially for time's sake, the most popular, ancient and modern, historically, the most popular designation for the behemoth is the hippopotamus, with the elephant as a very close second. And if you go through here, it does seem, with one possible exception, although we'll talk about that, to describe a hippopotamus pretty closely. That word behemoth is just transliterated. That comes straight out of Hebrew because we don't know what it means. Scholars, we still don't know. It's the plural of the common term for an animal or a beast. But all of the verbs used with it are singular. The other terms are. So in other words, the plural is used in referring to it throughout this passage, but we're talking about one animal. Sometimes in other languages, and this is true of Hebrew, a plural is used as an intensifier, an expression of greatness, grandness. So, in other words, what we might call this behemoth, the beast, animal, using it in the plural, it's the super beast, the super animal, the great mighty beast. If we were to translate it, that's what it would be like, but that's why it's just left as behemoth, the transliteration. We're going to take the position here that it is the hippopotamus, as I said, without getting lost in all this. That is my opinion. I think that that's correct. But we can't say for certain. Again, the hippopotamus is known today to inhabit Africa, of course, and then all the way up to Egypt. Today, it doesn't go any further than the third cataract of the Nile. That's those waterfalls on the Nile River. It doesn't go any further north than that, and of course, it would have to range further north to be able to make it into the area that Job lived in. But there is evidence in ancient times it lived in Lower Egypt. That is the area around the Nile Delta. Hieroglyphics referencing it, other things like that. We know that it lived that far, and so it stands to reason that it probably lived in Palestine and other points to the east as well. Now, you look at this guy, and if you don't know anything about the hippopotamus, you might not think of them as anything impressive. Like, really? That's the super beast? I mean, they look pretty fat and happy and jolly, don't they? Like, that guy's just a big snuggly teddy bear. He's not going to hurt you at all. Did you know that the hippopotamus kills about 3,000 people annually in Africa? Yeah, I see some nodding. Some of you watch some of those Discovery Channel specials and things like that too. Yeah, they're incredibly dangerous. They kill more animals than any other, or they kill more people than any other animal in Africa every year. A lot more, we get afraid of things like lions and all. These are much more dangerous than that. They can weigh nearly 2 tons. That's the average size of an adult male is 3,300 pounds. That's the average size. So they can get up to nearly 2 tons. They can run over 20 miles an hour. They have long canines, these tusks in their mouth. If you don't think that they're that scary, here's another picture I found. I was looking for them. Yeah, there's a hippo taking on a crocodile. And we're all pretty scared of crocodiles with good reason. And he's just taking care of it like it's nobody's business. So these things are tough. And the descriptions of it seem to match up. I think this, again, is the most likely example of what the behemoth is. When we go through this, the detailed descriptions keep this from being just a mythical portrait. This is not a hypothetical, a mythological animal. It's real. And yet, even with that said, there is this idea in the ancient world that sometimes animals, these creatures, represent cosmic forces, things that are more powerful. We've seen that even already in Job. And I think the language suggests here that there's some element to that as well. How this is a real animal, but it's also symbolic of something greater in context if Job could possibly control it. We've mentioned before, in the ancient Near East, this primordial sea monster was pictured as the enemy of God or the gods, and there were these different myths that the gods would demonstrate their power and their superiority by taming them, by defeating those sea monsters. Well, we have that sort of idea mentioned in passing in the Old Testament because it's common folklore, but the difference is God doesn't battle those things, He doesn't fight them, He's the creator of them. They're not on par with Him because He's controlled them from the beginning. We saw this already a couple of weeks ago. But sometimes Israel's enemies are labeled as Leviathan or Rahab, the name of another one of these cosmic sea monsters, to convey this dimension. We have that in the 74th Psalm, the 89th Psalm. That's also common in the Apocrypha, that is these intertestamental books, with the term behemoth. You see that in the first book of Enoch, for example. And we've seen that already in Job with Leviathan. That was used back in chapter 3, verse 8, with Rahab, chapter 9, verse 13. So, in talking about these animals, there is also this larger symbolic sense to them, too. God is addressing this bigger picture, this cosmic dimension of Job's suffering, this that's going on behind the scenes, that transcendent dimension that we saw back in the prologue with Satan going into the heavenly throne room. This is sort of representative of that, but the whole idea is Job doesn't control these things, but God is the master of them all. He stands behind everything in control despite Job's ordeal. If Job could rule the world in justice, which is what these questions we've already seen in this speech have been about, he would have to capture Behemoth and Leviathan. And if Job can't subdue those creatures, which are not only real creatures, they're also symbolic of these great cosmic powers, it's inconceivable that he's ready to take on God and to prove that God treats him unjustly. So this is God's response to Job's request to go into court, to have his day in court, to enter into litigation. You don't know what you're asking for, man. It's dangerous. You're certain to lose. If you can't even control these, how can you hope to stand up against me? So, with all that said, this speech and these sections about animals, this is more than just a continuation of that same thing we saw back in the first speech last week when God's talking about creation there, because the first one talks about or addresses the idea of God putting wisdom in the created order, that he created things with a purpose, that he continues to oversee it and overrule it. In this, he has the power to execute justice because he's in control of all of these things. So Job has the choice to either accept God's arguments, to trust in the fact that God is just, to trust in his power to execute that justice, or else he can try to fight against him. But can he control these two guys? The animal portraits, Behemoth verses 15 through 24, Leviathan is all of chapter 41. We'll look at that one next week. These are long. These are about double the length at least, if not longer, of those back in chapter 39. But the Behemoth, first of all, we have his strength and his bodily form, verses 15 through 18. His prominence, verses 19 through 20. His habits, verses 21 through 23. And the only time we have a rhetorical question is in verse 24, only the very last one. Instead of having all those questions about him the way that we did about those animals last week, this is just an observation, a sort of meditation. Hey, look at the Behemoth over here. What do you think about that animal? He's far beyond human strength, but he's one of God's pets. Let's read the whole thing here. Behold Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength is in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like bars of iron. He is the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near his sword. For the mountains yield food for him, where all the wild beasts play. Under the lotus plants he lies, in the shelter of the reeds and in the marsh. For his shade the lotus trees cover him. The willows of the brook surround him. Behold, if the river is turbulent, he's not frightened. He is confident, though Jordan rushes through his mouth. Can one take him by his eyes, or pierce his nose with a snare? So, first of all, God talks about his strength and his bodily form. Back in verse 15, just like Job, the Behemoth is part of God's creation. He made it. Now, he has a hearty appetite. He eats a great deal of grass, just like an ox. It has great strength. Behold, the strength in his loins. The loins are often portrayed as the source of strength in the Old Testament. We're probably familiar with that. The muscles in his belly, all of that attests to his great strength. Its tail is likened to a cedar tree, which is a symbol of majestic power. And this is the main objection sometimes people have had to the hippopotamus. You can't really see its tail there, but that's kind of the point. They don't have tails that are long and powerful. They have short, kind of curly tails, just like a pig does. These two lines, like a lot of Job, are riddled with uncertain words. Those who favor this being the elephant actually translate this as his trunk instead of his tail, again, because of the uncertainty. To put this as delicately as possible, it's also a possibility that this refers to mating, and that rather than referring to the tail of the hippopotamus, we're referring to its reproductive organs. In fact, if you have a King James version, instead of it saying thighs there, it says stones, because that's part of the sense that they were interpreting it there. And I think that's a possibility. It's the sort of thing we don't think of too much in the Bible, but those sorts of things are there at times. Verse 18 conveys his great strength. And then we have his prominence, verses 19 and 20. He's the first of God's ways. He's the crown of creation, and yet his maker can approach him with his sword. God didn't have to defeat the Behemoth because he created him. He didn't have to live in any sort of fear in him. He bears witness to God's majesty, and the fact that God can approach him freely, that just demonstrates God's mastery of him. You think about approaching him. I mentioned how many people the hippopotamus kills yearly. The most common reason that a person gets killed by a hippo is because they get in between them and their water source, their refuge there where they like to go. But you need to be afraid if you're close to a hippo, because they might charge you, and 2 tons running at 20 miles an hour, you're in trouble. But God doesn't have any reason to be afraid. He can do it without any sort of fear. The Creator has, in a sense, placed the hills at the Behemoth's service. It leaves water to graze peacefully on the banks. The mountains yield food for him. That word yield can also be translated as a tribute. It has that sort of double meaning. So it's as if he's the king of the beast. The mountains even bring tribute to him. We got his habits then. His favorite place to lie is on the riverbank in the shade. If you've seen those documentaries, that does sound like this guy here. Or perhaps to lie in the swamp. When the river floods, he's not worried about that because he's a strong swimmer. It can outswim any sort of swirling water. The Jordan here is used symbolically of any river. But we end then on this question: can you take him by the eyes or pierce his nose with a snare? Human beings, even in ancient times, did hunt the hippo, but they only did it with extreme caution and with trepidation. In popular lore, it was considered impossible to catch, which is kind of the root of the question here. Are you going to go out and catch him? Because even if people tried, you usually didn't. The favorite tactic was to pierce it through its nose so that then it had to breathe through its mouth. And when it opened its mouth wide to breathe, you'd stab it through the mouth because that's a weak point there, unlike that hard skin that's almost like armor around him. The implication is, Job, you're not ready to go out and tackle a beast like that. You dare not hunt something that fearsome. But God doesn't have to go out and hunt him and to try to fight against him because as its maker, he controls him completely. Just about out of time. Anybody with a question or a comment at this point? Yes, they are. Very. And they don't like you encroaching on their turf. Absolutely. And that's part of the point. God can approach him without any sort of fear, but are you going to just walk up into his territory? Not smart. Okay, we'll stop there and we'll pick up next week. We're just about done with this book. We're going to look at the portrait of Leviathan next week and then moving rapidly toward the last chapter. Thanks for your attention this morning.